The rain came down in long silver threads against the windshield of an old gray sedan, blurring the glow of a gas station sign that flickered on the far side of an empty parking lot. Inside the car, 19-year-old Emily Carter sat curled beneath a thin blanket that smelled faintly of motor oil in the diner where she had worked a double shift just hours earlier. The heater had stopped working 2 weeks ago, and the only light came from a small flashlight propped against the dashboard, its narrow beam falling across a water-stained photograph she held with both hands, as if it might slip away into the dark. On the front of the photograph was a cabin she had never seen before, half swallowed by pine trees, its porch sagging beneath years of snow and silence. On the back, in handwriting she would have recognized anywhere, even after everything, were 6 words that had kept her awake for 3 nights straight. For Emily, if things ever go wrong, remember Pine Hollow. She did not know what it meant. She did not know that in less than 2 weeks, that photograph would lead her down a road so overgrown it barely looked like a road at all, to a cabin no one else knew existed, and to a discovery that would not only change her life but reveal exactly what kind of man her father had truly been, and exactly what kind of woman her stepmother really was. But that was still ahead of her. Right now, all she had was the rain, the cold, and a photograph that felt like the only solid thing left in a world that had quietly collapsed beneath her feet. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. 3 months earlier, Emily's life had looked nothing like this. She had been sitting at her father's kitchen table, the same table where she had done her homework as a child, the same table where her father used to drink his coffee black while reading the morning paper out loud just to make her laugh. He had complained of chest pain on a Tuesday evening, dismissed it as heartburn, and was gone before the ambulance reached the end of the driveway. The house had gone quiet in a way Emily had never experienced before, a silence that pressed against her ears and made every footstep on the hardwood floor sound like an intrusion. Karen, her stepmother, had married Emily's father almost 6 years earlier, and in that time the warmth between her and Emily had never grown past polite distance. At the funeral, Karen wore black that looked freshly tailored and accepted condolences with practiced grace, her hand resting lightly on Emily's shoulder for photographs and nothing more. Emily noticed things in those days that she would later understand mattered far more than she realized at the time. The way Karen's phone buzzed constantly during the reception. The way she disappeared into the home office for long stretches, the door closed, papers shuffling. The way she stopped wearing her wedding ring exactly 9 days after the funeral, as if some invisible mourning period had quietly expired. It was on a gray Thursday afternoon, 3 months after the funeral, when Karen sat Emily down at that same kitchen table and explained, in the calm tone of someone discussing a scheduling conflict, that the house, the accounts, and everything else had been left entirely to her. Emily had no legal claim, Karen said. She was sorry, truly, but that was simply how the will had been written. Emily would need to find somewhere else to live. Karen gave her 2 weeks. Emily remembered staring at the grain of the wood table, the same table, tracing a small scratch near the edge that she had made with a fork when she was 8 years old. And her father had laughed instead of scolding her. She remembered thinking that the house did not feel like it belonged to anyone anymore. Not really. It felt like it was waiting for something. She just did not yet know what. The 2 weeks passed in a blur of cardboard boxes and silence. Karen was polite in the way that strangers are polite, offering bottled water and occasionally commenting on the weather, while Emily packed up 19 years of her life into the back of her sedan. Most of her father's belongings had already been moved into storage, sorted by people Emily did not recognize, men in gray uniforms who spoke quietly and avoided eye contact. On the last day, Emily found a single cardboard box sitting in the garage, half hidden behind a stack of paint cans, labeled in her father's handwriting with nothing more than her name. Karen said she had not noticed it. Emily took it without asking permission. That box would turn out to be the only thing that mattered. For the first month, Emily told herself it was temporary. She found a cheap motel near the highway, the kind with flickering vacancy signs and thin walls that let in every cough and television argument from the next room. She picked up extra shifts at the diner where she had worked part-time since she was 16, a place called the Roadside Griddle, where the owner, a heavy-set man named Walt with forearms like ham hocks and a perpetual coffee stain on his apron, let her work doubles without asking too many questions. The smell of bacon grease and burnt coffee clung to her clothes long after her shifts ended, but it was honest work and it kept her moving. When the motel money ran out, she started sleeping in her car. She learned the unspoken rules of it quickly, which parking lots were safe, which gas stations let you use the bathroom without buying anything, how to angle the seat so her back did not ache too badly by morning. She kept the cardboard box on the passenger seat beside her like a quiet companion. Some nights she did not even open it. She just rested her hand on the lid, feeling the rough edge of the cardboard, and let herself breathe. The worst part was never the cold or the hunger or the ache in her shoulders from sleeping at strange angles. The worst part was the quiet voice that crept in during the long hours before dawn, the one that whispered that her father had chosen this for her, that somehow in the end he had let her fall. She had spent 19 years believing he was the safest person in her world, and now she was sleeping in a car with a broken heater, and the only explanation anyone had given her was a legal document she had never been allowed to see. It was on a rainy Tuesday night, parked behind the diner after closing, that Emily finally opened the box. Inside were the small, ordinary things that make up a life. A pocket knife with a cracked handle. A stack of photographs rubber banded together, edges soft with age. A worn leather journal that smelled like cedar and old paper. A few receipts. A key ring with 3 keys she did not recognize. And tucked into a manila envelope at the bottom, half hidden beneath a folded flannel shirt that still carried the faint scent of her father's aftershave, was the photograph of the cabin. Emily had turned it over without thinking, expecting nothing, and found those 6 words written in blue ink, slightly smudged, as if written in a hurry. For Emily. If things ever go wrong, remember Pine Hollow. She sat with that photograph for a long time that night, rain tapping against the roof of the car in an uneven rhythm, the diner's back porch light casting a dull orange glow across the dashboard. Pine Hollow meant nothing to her. She had never heard her father mention it, not once, not in 19 years. And yet there was something about the handwriting, the urgency of it, the word ever, that made her chest tighten in a way she could not explain. The next morning, during a slow stretch at the diner, Emily asked Walt if he had ever heard of a place called Pine Hollow. He paused, wiping down the counter, and said the name sounded familiar. Something about an old logging road out past the county line, an area that had mostly been abandoned since the mill closed decades ago. He didn't know much more than that, but he gave her the name of the county records office, the kind of place, he said, where old-timers went to dig up information about land they were trying to sell or fight over. Emily went the following afternoon, during her one day off in 2 weeks. The records office smelled like dust and old paper, fluorescent lights humming overhead, ceiling tiles stained yellow with age. A clerk named Doris, an older woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, helped her search through property records using her father's full name. It took almost an hour, but eventually, buried in a filing cabinet that had not been opened in years, Doris found it. A small parcel of land, 11 acres, registered under her father's name, purchased decades earlier, with no mortgage, no liens, and no mention of it anywhere in the estate documents Emily had been shown. Doris squinted at the paperwork and said something that stuck with Emily for days afterward. She said it was strange, because properties like this usually got folded into estates automatically when someone passed. This one, she said, looked like it had been kept separate on purpose. Emily wrote down the directions Doris gave her on the back of a diner receipt, her hand shaking slightly, though she told herself it was just the cold. The drive out to Pine Hollow took almost 2 hours, the last 20 minutes on a road that grew narrower and rougher with every mile, until the asphalt gave way entirely to packed dirt and gravel, and then to something that was barely a road at all, just 2 ruts worn into the earth by tires long gone. Pine trees pressed in close on both sides, their branches forming a dark canopy overhead that turned afternoon into something closer to dusk. The air smelled of wet bark and decaying leaves, and somewhere in the distance a woodpecker hammered against a hollow trunk, the sound echoing oddly in the stillness. Emily's sedan was not built for this kind of road, and twice she had to stop and clear fallen branches before continuing. Her phone had lost signal almost a mile back. There was a strange comfort in that, she thought, a kind of forced quiet that made the world feel smaller and more manageable. And then, rounding a final bend, the trees opened into a small clearing, and there it was. The cabin from the photograph. It looked smaller in person, and somehow more tired, its log walls weathered to a silvery gray, the roof sagging slightly on one side where shingles had curled and lifted. A stone chimney rose from the side of the building, dark with soot near the top. The porch, the same porch from the photograph, creaked audibly even from a distance when the wind moved through it. Moss had crept up one corner of the foundation, soft and green against the gray wood, and a single window near the front door reflected the gray sky back at Emily like a closed eye. She sat in the car for a long moment before getting out, the engine ticking as it cooled, rain beginning to fall again in a fine mist that clung to her jacket the moment she stepped outside. The silence here was different from the silence of the empty house after her father's death. That silence had felt like absence. This silence felt like waiting. The front door was unlocked. Inside, dust hung in the air, catching what little light came through the grimy windows, and the smell of the place hit her immediately. Old wood smoke, mildew, and something faintly metallic underneath it all. A single room made up most of the cabin, a stone fireplace on one wall, a narrow bed pushed into the corner, its quilt faded but neatly folded, as though someone had made it carefully and then never returned. A small wooden table sat near the window, two mismatched chairs tucked beneath it, and on the table impossibly sat a kerosene lamp, its glass chimney clean as if it had been wiped down recently. Emily ran her finger along the edge of the table and felt a thin layer of dust, undisturbed in most places, but smudged near the lamp, in a shape that looked almost like fingerprints. Someone had been here, not years ago, recently. She moved through the cabin slowly, cataloging details the way she imagined a detective might, though she had no idea yet that this instinct would matter. A small pantry held a few canned goods, their labels faded but not rotted through, stacked neatly on a shelf. A coat hung on a hook by the door, too large to be Karen's, too small to belong to a stranger passing through. Emily pressed her face into the fabric without thinking and caught, faint but unmistakable, the same scent that clung to the flannel shirt in her box. Cedar, pipe tobacco, her father. It was near the back of the cabin, where a steep wooden ladder led up into a low attic space, that Emily noticed the floorboards beneath the ladder looked different from the rest. Newer, slightly raised at one corner as though they had been lifted and replaced more than once. She knelt down, running her fingers along the seam, and felt something her father had taught her years ago, almost as a game, back when she was a kid who liked to hide things in elaborate places. He used to say that the best hiding spots were the ones that looked like nothing at all. She climbed the ladder into the attic first, ducking beneath low rafters thick with cobwebs, her flashlight beam catching motes of dust suspended in the air like slow-falling snow. The attic was mostly empty, save for a few wooden crates pushed against the far wall, and beneath a loose section of flooring near the chimney, the unmistakable glint of metal. It took Emily nearly 20 minutes to pry the floorboards loose, working with the pocket knife from the box and her bare hands, splinters catching in her palms, her breath coming faster with every board she removed. Beneath the floor, set into a shallow recess and bolted to the beams below, was a steel safe, old-fashioned, with a dial combination lock and a handle worn smooth from years of use. She sat back on her heels, staring at it, rain ticking softly against the roof just inches above her head, and felt something she had not felt in months. Not grief, not exhaustion, not the dull ache of survival. Something closer to hope, though she did not yet trust it enough to name it. The combination took her 3 tries. The first 2 were birthdays, hers and her father's, both wrong. The third was the date carved faintly into the underside of the cabin's porch step, a date Emily had noticed on her way in without thinking much of it, a date that, she would later learn, marked the day her mother had died, years before Emily was even born to know her. The tumblers clicked into place and the heavy door swung open with a groan of old hinges. Inside was not money, not stacks of cash or gold, the kind of thing Emily, in her most exhausted and desperate moments, might have allowed herself to imagine. Instead, the safe was packed with paper. Journals, a dozen of them at least, bound in worn leather and held together with rubber bands. Manila folders thick with documents, property deeds, investment statements, bank records. Photographs, some of Emily as a child, some of people she did not recognize. And at the very back, tied together with string, a small bundle of envelopes, each one sealed, each one written in her father's hand, each one addressed simply to Emily. She did not open them right away. She sat there in the dim attic light for a long time, the safe open before her, rain falling steadily outside, and allowed herself to cry for the first time since the funeral. Not from grief alone, but from something more complicated, the strange and overwhelming feeling of being remembered. The first journal Emily opened was dated nearly 4 years before her father's death. His handwriting filled the pages in dense, careful script, the kind of writing that came from someone who thought before he wrote. The early entries were mundane, notes about weather, about a leaking gutter he kept meaning to fix, about a conversation with Emily after her first day of high school that had made him laugh for an hour afterward. But somewhere around the middle of that journal, the tone shifted. He had started noticing discrepancies in the household accounts. Small at first, a withdrawal here, a transfer there, amounts that did not match receipts or explanations. He wrote about asking Karen directly, and her answers that felt rehearsed, too smooth, too quick. He wrote about a feeling he could not shake, a feeling that something in his own home was being quietly rearranged without his knowledge. In a later journal, the entries grew more deliberate. Her father had begun keeping his own records, separate from the household, documenting transfers, dates, amounts, even photographing statements before Karen could, as he put it, lose them again. He wrote about consulting a financial advisor quietly, about discovering that several accounts he believed were joint had been restructured over the years into accounts where he was no longer a named party. He wrote, in one entry that made Emily's hands tremble as she read it, that he no longer trusted the will he had signed years earlier because he suspected it had been altered without his full understanding of the changes. And so he wrote, he had started over, quietly, without telling anyone. He had begun moving certain assets, ones Karen did not know existed, into a trust established years earlier under a different name, a trust intended for one person only, Emily. The cabin, he wrote, was not a getaway, though he let Karen believe that was all it was, an old hunting cabin he visited a few times a year to be alone. In truth, it was where he kept the only copies of documents he feared might disappear if anything ever happened to him. He wrote that he hoped he was being paranoid. He wrote that he hoped Emily would never need to find this place at all. He had been wrong about that, but right about almost everything else. The sealed letters were the hardest to read. The first one, the oldest by its slightly yellowed envelope, began simply, "If you are reading this, something has happened to me, and I am sorry I am not there to explain it in person." He wrote about Karen with a kind of weary honesty, not anger but disappointment. The disappointment of a man who had wanted to believe the best about someone and had slowly run out of reasons to. He wrote about the legal documents enclosed, the trust, the deeds, instructions for an attorney he trusted, a man he had known for over 20 years, someone outside of Karen's circle entirely. And then, near the end of that first letter, he wrote the words that Emily would return to again and again in the months that followed, words she would eventually have framed and hung above the door of a place that did not exist yet, though her father, in some quiet way, had already imagined it for her. He wrote that he was afraid she would mistake hardship for abandonment, that if things ever went wrong, and she found herself alone, struggling with no one in her corner, she might believe it meant she had been forgotten. He wanted her to know that was never true. He wrote that true wealth was not money, not property, not anything that could be taken from you in a courtroom. True wealth was knowing your own worth, especially when someone tried to convince you otherwise. Emily read that letter 3 times before she could move. Outside, the rain had softened to a gentle patter against the cabin roof, and somewhere beyond the trees, the clouds had begun to break apart, letting through thin shafts of late afternoon light that fell across the attic floor in long golden bars, illuminating the dust still drifting slowly through the air, settling now, like something finally allowed to rest. The drive back to town felt different than the drive out had. Emily kept glancing at the passenger seat, where the box of documents now sat, heavier than it had any right to be given how little it actually weighed. She thought about Karen, about the calm way she had explained that Emily had no legal claim, and wondered how much of that calm had been built on the assumption that no one would ever find what was hidden 11 acres into the woods, beneath a floor that had been replaced more than once by careful hands. The attorney her father had named in his letter, a man called Mr. Alden, still practiced law in a small office above a hardware store in the next town over. He was older now, his hair fully gray, but he remembered Emily's father immediately and listened without interruption as Emily laid the documents out across his desk, journal by journal, folder by folder, the late afternoon light slanting through dusty Venetian blinds and falling in stripes across the papers. Mr. Alden was quiet for a long time after she finished. Then he said something that Emily would remember for the rest of her life. He said that in over 30 years of practicing law, he had seen plenty of families fall apart over money. What he had rarely seen was a man plan this carefully, this quietly, for this long, just to make sure his daughter would never have to wonder whether she had been loved. The months that followed were, in many ways, harder than anything that had come before. Karen did not go quietly. When she was first contacted by Mr. Alden's office regarding the discovery of the trust and the additional properties, her initial response was disbelief, followed quickly by anger, and then by a kind of cold legal maneuvering that Emily recognized immediately from the months after her father's death. Karen's attorneys argued that the documents were fabricated, that the trust was invalid, that Emily had no right to assets that had never been disclosed during probate because they claimed they did not legally exist. But the journals told a different story, dated and detailed, corroborated by bank records that Mr. Alden's team began tracing piece by piece. A forensic accountant was brought in, a quiet, methodical woman named Ms. Okafor, who spent weeks tracing the paper trail Emily's father had so carefully documented years before. Slowly, Accounts began to surface that Karen had never disclosed. Smaller accounts at out-of-banks, transfers routed through names that on the surface seemed unrelated, until Miss Okafor laid them all out on a single timeline that even Emily, with no background in finance, could read like a map. A former bookkeeper for the household, a woman who had quietly resigned 2 years before Emily's father's death after what she described in a deposition as uncomfortable requests, came forward voluntarily once she learned the case was being reopened. She testified that she had been asked more than once to adjust figures and that did not match receipts, and that she had eventually left rather than continue doing so. Her testimony, combined with the journals and the financial records, formed a picture that was difficult for anyone, even a skeptical judge, to dismiss as coincidence. The court proceedings stretched across several months, hearings scattered weeks apart, each one chipping away at the version of events Karen had presented during the original probate. Emily attended every hearing, sitting beside Mr. Alden in a small courtroom that smelled of old carpet and floor polish, watching as the careful story Karen had built slowly came apart, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the quiet accumulation of details that no longer fit together. It was during the final weeks of the case that Mr. Alden's team uncovered the document that would change everything. Buried among the property deeds in the cabin's safe was a parcel of land Emily's father had purchased decades earlier, 11 acres at the time, though the deed referenced an adjoining purchase that had quietly expanded it over the years to nearly 40 acres total, on the outskirts of a town that, at the time of purchase, had been little more than a crossroads with a feed store and a gas station. That town had grown, slowly at first and then in the last several years rapidly, as highway expansion and new development pushed outward from the city nearly an hour away. The land Emily's father had bought for almost nothing decades earlier now sat directly along a proposed commercial corridor, the kind of location developers had been quietly trying to acquire for years. An appraisal, requested as part of the proceedings, valued the land at several $1,000,000, a number that Emily read 3 times before she fully understood what it meant. The final ruling came on a cold morning in early spring, the kind of morning where frost still clung to car windshields, but the light had a different quality to it, softer, less harsh, as though the season itself was beginning to shift. The judge ruled that significant portions of the estate, including the trust assets, the cabin, and the previously undisclosed land, had been wrongfully withheld from Emily during the original probate and ordered them returned to her in full, along with additional penalties related to the concealment. Emily sat in the courtroom and felt, for a long moment, almost nothing at all. Not relief, not joy, just a strange numbness, the kind that comes after holding your breath for so long that breathing normally again feels unfamiliar. It was only later that night, sitting alone in a new apartment, a small one-bedroom place she had moved into during the final weeks of the case, that the weight of it settled over her, slowly like snow accumulating on a roof. She thought about the diner, about Walt's stained apron and the smell of bacon grease that had once felt like the only constant in her life. She thought about the motel rooms, the nights in her car, the cold that had settled so deep into her bones that some mornings she had wondered if she would ever feel warm again. And she thought about her father, sitting alone in that cabin years ago, carefully copying bank statements by hand, hiding documents beneath floorboards, writing letters to a daughter he hoped would never need to read them, doing all of it quietly, without complaint, without ever once telling her what he had discovered or why. It would have been easier, Emily realized, for him to confront Karen directly, to fight it out in the open, to involve Emily in the conflict while he was still alive to guide her through it. But he hadn't. He had chosen instead to disappear into the background of his own life, to let Karen believe she had won, also that if the worst happened, Emily would inherit not a fight, but a foundation, not a burden, but a beginning. The final letter in the bundle, the one Emily had saved for last, almost without realizing she was doing it, was different from the others, shorter, the handwriting slightly less steady, as though written during a difficult week. In it, her father wrote about watching Emily grow up, about the summer she had insisted on learning to change the oil in his truck herself, about the way she used to fall asleep in the passenger seat on long drives with her cheek pressed against the window, leaving a small fog mark that he would sometimes leave unwiped for days afterward, just because he liked seeing it there. He wrote that he did not know what kind of woman Emily would become by the time she found this letter, if she ever did. But he hoped, more than anything, that whatever hardship had led her here, she had not let it convince her that she was alone. He wrote that the cabin had always felt to him like a kind of shelter, not just for documents, but for the part of himself that refused to believe the people who loved him could simply be erased by paperwork. He wrote, that Emily might one day think of it the same way. It took Emily nearly a year to decide what to do with the cabin. She could have sold it, along with the land, and in the months immediately following the ruling. That was the practical choice, the one Mr. Alden gently suggested more than once. The cabin itself was worth very little. The land around it, while not as valuable as the parcel near the growing town, was still substantial. Selling it would have simplified everything. But Emily kept returning to it, on weekends at first, then for longer stretches, driving the now familiar road that no longer felt quite as overgrown. Partly because she had hired someone to clear it, and partly, she suspected, because the road itself had simply been waiting for someone to use it again. She replaced the roof. She repaired the porch, careful to preserve the boards that creaked in the same places they always had, because somehow the sound felt important, a kind of voice the cabin had always had, and that she did not want to silence. She kept the kerosene lamp on the table, though she also installed proper electric lighting, because some things, she decided, did not need to be either old or new. They could simply be both. It was during one of those weekends, sitting on the newly repaired porch with a cup of coffee going cold beside her, watching morning light filter through the pines in long golden bars, much like the light that had fallen across the attic floor the day she found the safe, that the idea came to her. Not all at once, but slowly, the way ideas sometimes do, less like a lightning strike and more like a tide coming in. She thought about the months she had spent sleeping in her car, about the particular kind of loneliness that came not just from having nowhere to go, but from feeling as though no one in the world was keeping a place for you. She thought about the young people she sometimes saw at the diner during those long shifts, kids not much younger than herself, aging out of foster care with nowhere to land, carrying everything they owned in a single bag, the same way Emily had once carried everything she owned in a single cardboard box. The cabin, she realized, had been her father's safe house, a place built quietly, without announcement, to make sure that if everything else fell apart, there would still be something solid underneath. Emily decided, sitting there on the porch with the cold coffee and the warm light, that it could be that for other people too. It took nearly 2 years to make it happen. The original cabin became the centerpiece of a small retreat, several new buildings constructed around it in a similar style, log and stone, designed to blend into the surrounding pines rather than stand out against them. Emily worked with local contractors, many of whom remembered her father, and a few of whom had quiet stories of their own about the kind of man he had been, stories Emily collected the way she had once collected journal entries, each one adding a little more color to a portrait she was still, in some ways, completing. The retreat opened with little fanfare, a handful of young adults in those first months, kids aging out of the foster system, some who had been couch surfing, a few who had been sleeping cars of their own. Emily made sure each of them had their own space, small cabins scattered through the pines, each with a porch, because she had come to believe that a porch mattered more than people realized. A place that was neither fully inside nor fully outside, a place to sit quietly and watch the light change. She named the retreat Pine Hollow, the same name written on the back of that water-stained photograph, though most of the young people who stayed there never knew the story behind it, not at first. Some of them asked, eventually, the way people do when they sense a place has history, and Emily would tell them, in pieces, over time, the way her father had once left pieces of the truth for her to find every year. On the anniversary of the day she first climbed into that attic and pried open the floorboards with a cracked pocket knife, Emily walked out to the cabin alone, in the early morning, before any of the residents were awake. She would sit at the same wooden table, beneath the same window, and take out the same letter, the first one her father had written, the one about hardship and abandonment, about true wealth being the knowledge of your own worth. She did not need to read it anymore. She knew it by heart, but she read it anyway, every year, because some things were not about remembering. They were about returning, about sitting in the quiet, with the light coming through the trees and long golden bars, and feeling for a few minutes exactly as she had felt in that attic years ago. Not rich, not vindicated, just found. Outside, the pines moved gently in the morning wind, the same way they always had, the same way they probably always would, long after Emily was gone, long after the cabin had been rebuilt again by someone else's hands. Some places, she had come to believe, were never really about the buildings at all. They were about what people chose to leave behind for the ones who came after them, hidden carefully enough that only the right person would ever find it, and clear enough that once they did, they would never doubt, not for a single day afterward, that they had always been loved. And every year, when Emily finally folded the letter and tucked it back into its envelope, she would sit for one more moment in the quiet of the cabin, listening to the porch boards settle under the weight of the morning and think that somewhere, in some way she could not explain and did not need to, her father was still keeping watch, not over money or land or legal documents. Over her, the way he always had, the way in the end, he always would.